So, I had to read Vince Russo's two books, Forgiven and Ring Opera, and I'm going to be honest, I had a great time getting into the mind of one of pro wrestling's most controversial figures. Whereas other wrestling books can be a bit vanilla and quite by the numbers, Russo's books can sometimes read like his old WWF magazine articles, so his writings aren't typical by any means, and Vince expects his readers to be generally up to speed with what's been going on in the pro wrestling world. Loads of the stories he tells have been debated over the years. Some say his books have a lot of old rubbish included, such as Russo saying the Montreal incident was all his idea. But I enjoyed Vince's books because even if he is perceived as wrong, he's dead set on his philosophies, his thoughts on the business, and the things he truly believes in. You don't have to be a fan of the guy's work to appreciate his unrelenting convictions, whether right or wrong. I picked out some quotes that I felt you guys would enjoy. I'm unable to pick out every single controversial quote or quip because there's just so many of them, but these are the ones I thought my viewers would get the most out of. You may have heard some of these stories before, but they're definitely worth revisiting. So let's start with Russo's best friend in the entire world, Mr. James E. Cornette. I'll also let you know what book each quote's from if you want to read more. I wasn't just working with Vince McMahon, I was working with Vince McMahon and James E. Cornette. Man, this was a mistake. You see, at the time, Jim Cornette and I went together like Ludacris in NASCAR. I wanted attitude, he wanted Bullet Bob Armstrong. To give you an example of Cornette's mindset, he actually used to travel around with a gun under the driver's seat of his car in case he was attacked by fans, because he was a heel. We're talking 1997 here folks, not 1977. Personally, I had nothing against Jim, I just felt his way of thinking in 1997 was wrong. In my opinion, you can't book now like you did 20 years ago because the fans are smart, they know it's a work. Today's fans react to the product in a negative way if they feel their intelligence is being insulted. Old school bookings based on one simple axiom: the fans are stupid and they'll eat whatever you serve them because they don't know enough to question why you're booking what you're booking. In their minds, no one's booking anything, it's all happening for real. Even though we were driving McMahon nuts, I stuck to my guns because I knew I was right. As a company, I knew where we had to go. My advantage actually came from studying my son Will, who was about 11. I used to make a point of seeing what was hip to him. What was he watching? What was he listening to? Yeah, he was a bit younger than our demographic, but he was the next generation. He was the future. Cornette, Vince, Pritchard, Ross, none of them had that advantage. After a few weeks, I could see Vince was coming around more and more to my way of thinking, and then Cornette came up with the angle that would forever seal his fate on the booking committee. Jim's idea was to have Cactus Jack, aka Mick Foley, wheel a huge box down the ringside. Week after week we would see this box until Terry Funk emerged. When asked why, Jim answered, "Anybody who comes out of a box is instantly over." To this day, that's the greatest line I've ever heard. I've even considered using it for the title of this book. I thought Vince was gonna die when he heard it. To appease Jim, Vince came up with the character of Chainsaw Charlie, who would chainsaw his way out of the box immediately upon his arrival in the WWF. Man, it just wasn't going to work. Cornette and Russo, all that arguing. All we were doing was wasting Vince's time and the company's money. I had a meeting with Vince and told him exactly that. I said one of us had to go, and if it was me, I totally understood. The next week, Cornette was off the booking committee. Rock bottom. When you hit it, you know it. There's no place else to sink. When the creative team wrote in Fake Razor and Fake Diesel, the former WWF characters of Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, who we'd lost to WCW, that was it for me. Embarrassed isn't the word. I had moved on to ashamed. What really boggled my mind was the fact that Vince himself was going along with it. At the time, I felt it was a total disgrace. How Vince could ever have thought that this was going to work was way beyond my comprehension. It's kind of like the Mets deciding to trade Mike Piazza, replacing him with me, and then trying to pass me off as Mike Piazza. It was inexcusable. At times I thought Vince had lost his mind. He was nearing desperation, if not already beyond it. I was told at the time that the WWF was tightroping that thin monetary line between black and red. Many inside Titan Tower suspected that Vince was in financial trouble, even though that was kept hush-hush. Me, I'd given up. The product was unwatchable. I had to laugh when the Fake Diesel and Fake Razor angle became such a disgrace that, in the storyline itself, they wound up putting the heat on good old JR. The Okie was bringing these guys into the Federation to get back at Vince McMahon for firing him a couple of years earlier. The good thing, at least writers were starting to use some reality in their storylines. The bad thing was they couldn't figure out the best way to execute it. It was pathetic. I'd seen better Corey Feldman movies. It was getting to the point I didn't want to be associated with the company. It was only a matter of time before I opened the doors and invited Glenn into the creative meetings at WCW. If not for anything else, I was always highly entertained. Glenn was harmless and we all knew that and loved him for it. He made the creative meetings enjoyable, a word that isn't often used in the wrestling business. Glenn always had a way of reminding us that this was supposed to be fun, not the living hell that it had turned into for most of us. I think for as long as I live, I will never forget one of Glenn's favourite pitches. I remember one day walking into the creative meeting a few minutes early and seeing Glenn writing feverishly on the boardroom whiteboard. The diagram he was scribbling seemed somewhat involved and intriguing, but I had no idea what it was. I had to interrupt the genius at work and ask, "Glenn, what's this?" Without missing a beat, he turned around and said, "This is the angle that's going to change the face of the wrestling business forever." It's hard to describe his childlike excitement. It's the Martian invasion angle. There's a takeover in WCW by a hostile heel group. Keep in mind that Glenn's using his self-drawn diagrams to help bring light to his vision. And in time, it's revealed that they're Martians and their leader is Lance Storm. But wait, there's a twist. Just when it looks like the Martians are going to be in total control of WCW, we pan over to the announce desk and zoom in on Mike Tenay. Appearing in an almost hypnotic state, Mike slowly rises from his chair. Then the unthinkable happens. Antennas sprout from Mike's head and we find out that he, not Lance, was the mastermind behind the takeover all along. What do you think? The truth? I thought it was genius. You see, unlike wrestlers who claim to be writers but are actually bookers, Glenn resides outside the box. There is no black, no white, no baby faces, no heels. Is "Hey Hey We're the Monkeys" once crowned? Only shades of grey. Everybody in the wrestling business is going to hate me for saying this because they're never going to hear the end of it. But yes, Glenn Gilberti is a creative genius. A few years ago, when I almost went back to the WWE, I told Vince about Glenn and proposed to him that once I came back, I wanted Disco to be part of the creative team. Vince had no problem with this, since I had never steered him wrong before when it came to someone else's talents. I went back a few weeks later to further talk things out. Prior to wrapping up our covert meeting, I asked Vince when I could tell Glenn that he could start. Vince paused, and I knew there was a problem. With a look of severe seriousness on his face, the boss looked at me and said, I'm not too sure about your friend Glenn, Vince. I heard something about some ridiculous Martian invasion angle that he wanted to do at WCW, and I just don't know." Let me break it down for you. Somehow, someway, somebody within WCW who wanted to bury Glenn out of pure jealousy caught wind of Glenn's Martian invasion angle. That certain someone took the story to the dirt sheets who printed it, not as a goof, but as Glenn being serious. Now, on the other side at the WWE, someone close to Vince, they had to be close to Vince because Vince would have had to tell them about hiring Disco, reads the dirt sheet. Vince never reads the sheets himself. In an effort to discredit Glenn, obviously because of their own insecurities, they tell Vince about the strange and questionable creativity of his new would-be booker. Vince in turn buys the Martian invasion angle as serious, so he now tells me he has second thoughts about Glenn. You couldn't make a story like that up. To this day, I take nothing away from Goldberg. Nothing. Sure, there are those who'll tell you that it was scripted, that he went out there and beat everybody in the world in seconds, but remember, with each and every spear, he had to make you believe it, and Goldberg did. When I joined WCW, I felt that Hulk and Flair immediately needed to be fixed. Right or wrong, that was my professional opinion. At the same time, I also felt that Bill Goldberg needed his share of some tweaking. By some means, we needed to humanize this animal. We needed the fans to see a different side of Goldberg, that he was human, flesh and bone just like everyone else. The only way that was going to be accomplished was by having him losing. In order for us to take the character to the next level, we had to see how he would deal with adversity. And I'm not talking about Goldberg losing to some slouch or being upset. My choice of the man to defeat Goldberg was Big Papa Pump Scott Steiner. Goldberg hated it from the get-go, and not only that, he resented me for even coming up with the idea. I explained to him face to face, man to man, that I thought it was the best thing for the company. Bill vehemently disagreed. When I then flat out asked him what the problem was, Goldberg looked at me and said, if this were real, Scotty would never beat me. How do you respond to that? Not only wasn't wrestling real, but I also had to question whether or not Bill could legitimately beat Steiner. The truth is, on his best day, I don't even think he would have come close. At that point I realised I wasn't going to get anywhere with Bill. He flat out wasn't going to lose to Steiner, period. At this point I had no choice but to go to the Yankee ball cap wearing head of TBS and TNT, Brad Siegel, for advice. During our phone conversation, Brad couldn't believe what I was telling him. He kept saying over and over again, but it's not real, it's wrestling. Finally, Brad had no choice but to fly Goldberg to his office in Atlanta with Bill's agent, so the head of TNT and TBS could tell him that he had to lose a fake wrestling match. Being at that meeting was almost surreal. The head of Turner Broadcasting was taking time out of his schedule to tell a grown man and his agent that he had to lose a scripted match. Leaving Brad's office that day, I knew that the issue wasn't over. Bill made that clear when he left the office red-faced. Unfortunately, I, and I alone, was going to have to make sure that this thing was executed the day of the pay-per-view. It was hours before the pay-per-view, and I was doing what I usually do, making sure that the talent was as prepared as they possibly could be. With my production tunnel vision in full effect, I was interrupted by head agent Johnny Ace Laurinaitis. Vince, he said, you've got to go in there, pointing to Bill Goldberg's locker room. It's Goldberg, he doesn't want to do the job. You know what? At this point I wasn't scared, I wasn't intimidated, and I wasn't panicked. I was just fed up. I went into Goldberg's locker room without hesitation. I immediately saw Bill sitting in a chair backwards, staring into space and breathing heavy, real heavy. To this day, I don't think I've ever seen someone that mad. Suddenly, he started this rocking motion, coming across like a coiled cobra just moments before he was about to strike. I remember looking at him and not being scared at all. Why? Because I just couldn't believe how ridiculous this all was. We're talking about a grown man losing a fake match. At that point, I grabbed another chair that was in the room, turned it around just like Bill was, and sat face to face with this breathing, snorting, coiled dragon. I remember asking Bill what the problem was, and his answer was deafening silence. He just began to snort louder and rock faster. Where these next words came from, I have no idea. I'm not that brave or that stupid. Without hesitation, I blurted out, "You're not intimidating me, so if you're gonna hit me, and let's get this thing over with." I guess it was the shock of the sentence that caught Bill off guard and almost immediately changed his demeanour. "I'm not gonna hit you." And at that point, the conversation was over. I got up and left the room, and later that night, Goldberg lost to Scott Steiner. Looking back, I guess I kinda backed Bill into a corner, calling his bluff. I mean, if he wasn't going to hit me, then what was he going to do? Brad Siegel's word was final, and he knew that. In hindsight, WCW created a monster in Goldberg before I even got there. They allowed him the power to believe his own hype, to believe he was something that, in retrospect, he really wasn't. I blame the machine for this one, I truly do. Bill Goldberg has too big a heart, as I witnessed when I saw him many times around kids, to be a bad guy. Let's call a spade a spade. I never, not for one day, enjoyed working with Scott Hall. From the minute I met Scott, he was difficult to deal with. Whether he was just kidding or that was just him, it was a chore. The guy just liked to make your job harder, plain and simple. Now that's okay once in a while, but with Scott it was all the time. The sad part about it was that when you finally got Scott to do what you wanted him to do, he was without a doubt one of the best in the business. Unfortunately, those times were rare, for me anyway. Regardless of what anybody tells you, Scott could turn it on and off. The reason I say that is because when I saw him around kids, Scott was a different person. He acted as a hero to them. I saw it in person when he took some time with my own nephew many years ago. Around a child who only knew him as a star, Scott lived up to the billing of hero, but when I worked with Hall, he chose to be difficult, primarily because he saw it as part of his gimmick. Still though, I don't know Scott well. I believe inside he has a heart of gold. Kevin Nash, he'd drive Freud nuts. The guy is one of the greatest manipulators I've ever seen, and I'm not saying that in a negative way. Kevin is street smart, probably more street smart than anyone I've ever met. He can read people and own people. Combine his mental ability and his physical presence, and Nash is an imposing force. Many people are intimidated by him. Kevin knows that, and he enjoys it. The guy is just so sharp. If I have one criticism of Kevin, it's that at times he can be moody. When he'd show up for work, I never knew which Nash I was going to be dealing with, but at the time I was probably one of the moodiest guys you'd ever meet. But I just want to say this about Kevin Nash. When he worked for WCW, he did everything I ever asked him to do, period. Yeah, many times he'd screw with you before he did it, but that's just Kevin. Shawn and I had a love-hate relationship from the beginning. My impression, he was probably a bit spoiled growing up, as many of us were. However, as an adult, if Shawn Michaels didn't get his way, he was difficult to deal with at times. And when he wasn't happy with something, he let you know. On more occasions than one, I witnessed Shawn standing up to Vince, with Vince completely backing down. Now, whether it was Vince just not wanting to deal with him, I don't know, but 9 out of 10 times Shawn got his way with the boss. I never saw anyone else confront Vince the way Shawn did, ever. One of the most difficult things I had to do during my tenure as head writer for the World Wrestling Federation was to look at Mick Foley in the eye and tell him he wasn't going to be a part of the main event at WrestleMania 15. Mick's dream was the main event at WrestleMania, and knowing that, I did everything within my power to make that happen. WrestleMania 15 was going to headline with Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, and Mick Foley competing in a 3-way match to determine the WWF champion. Vince agreed to it, and we were set. The Raw that was already written for that week was to lay down the groundwork for the match. Well, when we arrived at the building, Shawn Michaels made an appearance, an unbooked, unanticipated, unexpected appearance. Shawn got in Austin's ear and somehow convinced Steve that the WrestleMania 15 main event should just be himself and The Rock. Austin, who was on the surface a good friend of Mick's, then went to Vince, and as he had done before when it came to talent, Vince caved, or changed his mind. Mick was out, just like that. I was nuts at Shawn, livid. If anyone deserved to be in the main event at Mania, it was Mick. And of course, nobody had the Spaldings to tell Mick he was out, so I had to do it. Looking in his eyes that day, he was crushed. We both knew it was absolutely wrong, but that's how the business is, most of the time. Later on, I think I buried Shawn to somebody, probably Hunter. After catching wind of it, the Heartbreak Kid threatened to kick my butt if I said another word. I think his exact words were, "I know I can take you." Whether Shawn wanted to kick my butt or not didn't really matter to me at the time. What mattered was that a good man took the hammer. But as always, Mick did business without ever saying a word. That's just the way Mick is. Following WrestleMania 15 and the headaches leading up to it, Vince never wanted to see or hear from Shawn Michaels again. He was just flat out done with him. But there I was at Vince's house every week, lobbying to bring back the Heartbreak Kid. Right around the corner from my office on the second floor of Titan Tower was the costume department, where this woman, whose name now escapes me, would work up drawings of concepts for new WWF characters. Rummaging through her office when she wasn't there was a great way for me to keep up with the creative ideas they had in store for the poor, innocent, unsuspecting fans. At the time, there was a character running around the Federation by the name of Who. Who was Jim the Anvil Neidhart under a mask, but nobody was supposed to know that. Bruce Pritchard once explained to me that Who was supposed to be some sort of cheap shot directed at Hulk Hogan, who was then with WCW. To this day, I fail to see the connection, but then again, Bruce may have seen many things that other people couldn't see. Anyway, Bruce continued on with the character Who to mainly entertain himself. The real joke was, however, nobody else was getting it. But that wasn't bad enough. As I was sifting through drawings on the designer's desk, I came across a sketch for Who's tag team partner, What. More than anything else, this should represent just how far apart the two companies were at the time. The WCW was doing Hall and Nash, the Outsiders, and we were doing Who and What. There's no doubt in my mind that Who and What would have appeared on television if the landscape hadn't changed. It was sometime in late January 2000 when I received a phone call from Brad Siegel, the executive in charge of TBS and TNT. "Vince, there's someone I want you to talk to. He'll be calling you." That's all Brad said. However, that's all he had to say. I knew immediately who Brad was speaking of. I knew that the next call was going to come from Eric Bischoff. It was no secret that Brad was a huge Eric fan. The only real opinion I had of Eric at that time was from my one and only phone conversation with him. It was probably back in late 96 or early 97, during which time he was the cock of the walk and he knew it. Almost needless to say, his manner reflected this. During that conversation, he just came across as arrogant, as if he were doing me a favour by just talking to me. In his defence, he probably was doing me a favour. At that time, I was just a nobody looking for a chance, an opportunity, one that Eric Bischoff never gave me. From the start, Eric and I never liked each other and never trusted each other. We were cordial to each other because neither one of us had a choice in the matter. I was never asked if I wanted to work with Eric Bischoff, and I'm almost certain he was never asked if he wanted to work with me. If we were, I'm certain both of us would have said thanks, but no thanks. Add to that I had no idea what the packing order was. Was I now reporting to Eric? Was he a consultant? Brad never laid any of that out to me anyway. It's nothing personal against Eric at all. We were just two totally different animals with two completely different styles and approaches. I started to get the feeling that Eric didn't know a good show from a bad show until the internet told him Tuesday morning. Again, not only in defense of me, but in defense of the entire creative team. I started having a huge problem with this. We're spending hours on the show and you're going to negatively critique it only after it aired? What about before? Isn't that the way it's supposed to work? Eric was always a main event guy. I was always a mid-card and below guy. Why? Because on many occasions you couldn't tell the veterans anything, especially at WCW. In their minds, since they're making a ton of money, they knew everything. The less experienced talent would hang on to every word you said because they wanted to get better. It's those guys I'm in the business for to this day. It's an honour and a pleasure to share with them every ounce of knowledge I have in my 17 years in this business, and that's where Eric and I had massive, unfixable differences. To this day, it boggles my mind when I'm told of the negative tone that Ric Flair had towards me in his autobiography. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not looking for a standing ovation here, but the truth is, I coddled his son like no other. I took care of David and put David centre stage when others, even some on my own committee, saw nothing in him. I would think that Rick would have seen that and maybe even appreciated it, but I don't know if he ever did. And to be blatantly honest here, I will never understand that. However, in wanting to make something crystal clear here, I never did any of that for Eric. I did it all for David. In my eyes, he was deserving, he had a terrific attitude, and was extremely respectful. That's all anyone could ask. Since this is a book based 100% on honesty, let me also set the record straight on something. Sometime during my angle with Flair, the Nature Boy approached me with an idea. "Vince, what if you shave my head?" Now, even in the wildest imagination of Vince Russo, that thought would have never even have crossed my mind. I mean, we're talking about Ric Flair for crying out loud, and out of respect alone, I would have never even thought of such a dastardly deed. I remember adamantly trying to talk Rick out of it, but the truth is, he insisted. You can only imagine how shocked and surprised I was when, in his own book, in his own words, while taking yet another shot at me, Rick suggested that the head shaving idea was my brainchild from the start. I get tickled, absolutely tickled, when I hear the critics say that Vince Russo killed WCW. Man, that's a lot of hard work and dedication for just one man in just under a 3-month span, because that's exactly how long I had any kind of control at WCW. I mean, to take a 13-year-old company and utterly destroy it in a matter of 3 months, I'm Cloverfield, that alien that took Manhattan down in a day, so I guess anything's possible. Going back to 1988, remember that WCW was Ted Turner's brainchild. He was behind it and gave it his full support. Well, when I showed up on the scene, Ted was well on his way out. The AOL Time Warner merger had just taken place, and a whole new sea of bigwigs were now looking down their snouts at grown men groveling around in their underwear. Regardless of the ratings, they didn't want it. To them, they were a legitimate television station, and wrestling was a joke. The nameless and faceless suits killed WCW, not Vince Russo, not Eric Bischoff, not Hulk Hogan's salary. You definitely have more of a case if you want to argue that WCW almost killed Vince Russo. Never in my entire life have I had to deal with such depression. It was crippling, it was taking my very life from me. As a man, a husband and a father, I uprooted my entire family to move to Atlanta, Georgia to work for WCW. I stripped them of all the security they knew, only for Bill Bush to tell me 90 days later that they, WCW, were going in a new direction. I took Will, VJ and Annie from family and friends. I took them from their schools and familiar surroundings. I took everything from my wife, Amy, that she had built in her life to work for a company that was never worthy of her sacrifices. Never. Those who were responsible for ousting me should have been ashamed of themselves. In order for them to jump a spot, they buried an innocent family in the process. I was both ashamed and embarrassed, and depressed, very depressed. I spent days and nights in the basement of my house, too defeated to even rear my ugly head. I felt I'd let my family down, and as the provider, there was nothing worse in the world. The quotes I've given you here are just the tip of the iceberg, and as mentioned at the top of this video, I actually enjoyed reading these because Russo's just so different from your average pro wrestling personality. You don't need to be a fan to get something out of the books. You might find things to laugh at, you might find things that make you seethe a little, but that's what Vince wants from his readers. He wants to get a reaction while telling his side of the story. Whether you believe his words or whether you believe the other side of the coin, that's totally up to you. But Russo does a great job of transporting you back to the Wild West days of pro wrestling, and that kind of stuff's right up my alley. Both books are still available on Russo's site, by the way, so pick them up if you want to read more. Thank you very much for watching, folks, and please take care.